Today I want to discuss a little bit of major breaking news with you guys. Linus Torvalds has just announced that he is taking a break from Linux. He is stepping back from his position as far as the development of the Linux kernel. He is going to leave. He says temporarily. Who knows? It may be longer than temporarily. Also, the Linux kernel has announced that they're implementing a new code of conduct for Linux developers. These two stories, that Linus is taking a break and that the Linux kernel now has a new code of conduct, has created a lot of debate and a lot of argument out there on mailing lists and forums. Basically, our open source community right now, it's in conflict. Let's discuss. So let's start with the big story here. So Linus Torvalds takes a break from Linux. So I'm going to link to this particular article in the show description, but there are dozens of articles out there right now about this gigantic news. This article is from ZDNet. This is written by Stephen J. Von Nichols. He mentions that Linux's creator is stepping back from his Linux kernel work to work instead on his behavior toward other developers. So Linus has announced that he's taking a break, at least temporarily. Who knows? Maybe it's temporarily, maybe it's longer than temporarily. No one can be sure. Linus probably isn't sure. But in this surprising move, he's taking a break from the kernel work. Basically, it mentions to work on his behavior toward other developers, and that is in fact the case. Linus has mentioned that his behavior in the past has been detrimental to development as far as on the kernel, that he has not treated others with respect, that his behavior has been unacceptable. He's been doing this for decades, right? So in a note to the Linux kernel mailing list, and I will of course link to his post on the mailing list at LKML, Linux kernel mailing list.org, Linus posted this letter here where he wrote, basically, I'll quote him in this one section, "I need to change some of my behavior, and I want to apologize to the people that my personal behavior hurt and possibly drove away from kernel development entirely." And he is right. His behavior has been unacceptable for a long time. And sadly, because he is one of the two figureheads for the operating system we all love and use on a daily basis, really, the GNU/Linux operating system, are two big figureheads, of course, Richard Stallman and, of course, Linus Torvalds. And both those guys are really not what we need to be putting out in the public, at least not the way they normally act. Richard Stallman, he's usually, his behavior is just weird. He is kind of a strange and eccentric individual, and he states some very off-the-wall and way out of the mainstream views on a lot of things. Linus, his problem is really his attitude and his behavior toward others, especially in public. And because of Stallman and Torvalds being figureheads, a lot of people just laugh it off. Their behavior, the things they say. Linus especially. Linus says some things that we would never allow with anybody else. But, when Linus treats people the way he sometimes treats people in public, we just laugh it off and say, you know what, that's Linus. That's Linus being Linus. But you know what? It's unacceptable, and I think Linus he's come around to realize that his behavior has been unacceptable. So I do commend him actually for writing this apology here. Again, he needs to change some of his behavior. I want to apologize to the people that my personal behavior hurt. So that is big. Linus rarely apologizes. He never apologizes for his personal attacks. At least he's never done this in the past. So I do want to at least give him some kudos for that. And he's right. His behavior has drove people away from kernel development. There are many, many news stories out there. You guys can look it up over the years of, kernel developers leaving the project because they did not like the way Linus Torvalds treated them. He insults them, calls them names, he curses at them, sometimes on mailing lists, in articles, face to face. And he has driven a lot of people away from kernel development. He is also, because of his behavior, he doesn't mention this in this post, but there are a lot of people that probably would have contributed to the kernel but for fear of the way they would be treated by somebody like Linus Torvalds, because they see the way he treats, other developers. Well, I have something I want to contribute to the kernel, but you know what? I'm afraid of Linus, so you know what? I'm not even going to get into that. I'll work on some other project. So his behavior, it's been a real detriment to the kernel development team. So I think he realizes that Linus has been working on the kernel for about 3 decades now. He's been working on the kernel for 30 years. So for 30 years, he's worked on the kernel. He's become very famous, well known for his outbursts, his sharp tone he takes with all the kernel developers. Again, we kind of laugh about it in the community. We joke about it. We see it as kind of funny. We shouldn't, because again, he often curses people, insults them, calls them names. He insults their code. Recently, I remember one famous incident where he called for someone's code to be, quote, retroactively aborted. This is not somebody acting in a professional manner. Somebody that leads a very important project like the kernel, and the Linux Foundation. You don't see major like CEOs of companies and corporations acting the way Linus does. And we've kind of just, again, brush it off. Well, you know what? But this is something different. The kernel is so important. We don't mind Linus being toxic in nature and acting like a complete jackass, because we need somebody like that, over the kernel, running the kernel, because the kernel is so important. No, because the kernel is no more important than many, many, many other large projects, free and open source projects, and even proprietary companies. But you don't see the people in charge, the CEOs, COOs, presidents of companies, or whoever, acting the way Linus acts, And again, we shouldn't just brush it off. He should be held accountable. He's holding himself accountable. Again, I got to give him some props on that. His most famous outburst, you guys remember, a couple of years back, there was a conference he was attending, and this is on camera too. You can look it up on YouTube. Most of you have already seen it, where somebody asked him his thoughts on NVIDIA, and he turned and he looked at the camera and he gave the camera the finger and said, F NVIDIA. And we laughed it off. People made t-shirts about it. People got computer wallpapers with him giving the bird and saying F NVIDIA. There's bumper stickers made of it. And we just kind of laugh it off, that kind of behavior. But is that somebody we want leading the movement? I mean, it's a question we need to really consider. I like Linus personally. I think he's a great guy. Obviously, I love Linux, but some of this does need to be under control, right? He's a little out of control at times. He lets himself do things that, again, the general public, you couldn't get away with this in public, right? You would never say some of the things that Linus says to people to somebody in public. You wouldn't do it. It's just common courtesy, common sense. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, Linus began talking about preparing for the eventuality of him leaving the Linux project. He started talking about the day he leaves Linux, and people were already starting to wonder about that, but he played it off as, you know what, I see some of these other open source projects that die because the main dev, the lead of the project, suddenly passes away or quits or gets sick or whatever happens, and then those projects don't know what to do. In some cases, those projects die because the main dev died. And he was wanting to make sure, in the eventuality of him leaving the Linux project, eventually he'll leave, he'll quit or move on to something else, or, eventually pass away. He wanted to make sure there was an orderly transition for his successors. But when he posted that, it didn't seem like his departure was imminent. Turns out, seems to be the case. So, quick quote from this mailing list article again. Quote, simply my own reaction to having screwed up my scheduling of the Maintainer Summit. So he's talking about, there was a kernel summit recently, a Maintainer Summit that was supposed to take place in Vancouver. And Linus Torvalds always is at these summits. He has to take part in these. Anyway, he scheduled a family vacation for him and his family in Scotland during that Maintainer Summit that was being held in Vancouver. And that caused a little bit of controversy. Reading a little bit more, Linus says, I was somewhat embarrassed about having screwed up my schedule, But honestly, I was mostly hopeful that I wouldn't have to go to the kernel summit that I've gone to every year for just about the last 2 decades. So he screwed up his calendar, he did the scheduling snafu is what he's claiming, that he scheduled family vacation, in Scotland when he should have been at the kernel summit in Vancouver. But he does admit, honestly, he was hopeful he wouldn't have to go to the kernel summit. He was hoping they would just have it without him. They would not do that. They could not do that. What they did was they all changed their schedules to meet him, on his vacation in Scotland and meet with him for a little bit for what they needed to do at this summit. But anyway, it looked really bad. It looked like Linus either didn't care to go to the kernel summit, or maybe he was being a diva. It's like, hey, you guys just come meet me wherever I'm at. Just forget about whatever plans we've been making for months as far as the kernel summit in Vancouver. You guys change all your flights, meet me in Scotland, So it was not it didn't look good when he did that. And this was where I guess he decided he needed to really look himself in the mirror and see what's going on. Reading a little more from the mailing list, he says, quote, "This is not some kind of I'm burnt out or I just need to go away moment. I'm not feeling like I don't want to continue maintaining Linux, quite the reverse. I very much do want to continue to do this project that I've been working on for almost 3 decades. This is more like the time I got out of kernel development for a while because I needed to write a little tool called Git." So he mentions he's not burnt out, he's not quitting Linux, he's not tired of working on Linux. He just wants to take a break. He'll come back, but he took a break once before. He claims he took a break when he decided he needed to develop a tool called Git, Git. You guys know Git, the very popular free and open source project that Linus created. Anyway, so Linus, he's stepping back for a few weeks, few months, maybe permanently. Who really knows? But that is, of course, the big news. But the other big news is that the Linux kernel, because of Linus leaving and Linus needing to reflect on how he treats others, they're implementing a new code of conduct. So over on the mailing list again, they are going to start using the Contributor Covenant Code of Conduct. What is the Contributor Covenant Code of Conduct? I'll read a little bit of it. Our pledge: in the interest of fostering an open and welcoming environment, we as contributors and maintainers pledge to making participation in our project and our community a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of age, body size, disability, ethnicity, sex, yada, yada, the standard kind of pledge, standard code of conduct. Some examples of behavior: use welcoming and inclusive language, be respectful, gracefully accept criticism, focus on what is best for the community, show empathy toward others. Nothing controversial about that code of conduct at all, right? Wrong. The open source community just blew up when they heard that the kernel guys were implementing this new code of conduct. Over on Reddit, there are just a million posts about it. Some of these posts have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of comments about the code of conduct being implemented. Some of these threads are full of a lot of infighting, a lot of divisive and toxic insults, and a lot of political crap. Why? It's because this contributor code of conduct, the person that wrote it is Coraline Ada Imke. Now, Imke, she has been around for a long time, worked on a number of different free and open source projects. Ruby, she worked for GitHub for a little while. Anyway, the thing with Imke is she is very, very political. Other than just working on free and open source projects, she uses these free and open source projects really as platforms to spout her politics. Some of it very activist kind of politics, very, again, divisive kind of politics. She is really kind of in your face with a lot of her political views, and we really don't need that in the community. Now, that being said, the code of conduct that she wrote, she wrote the Contributor Covenant Code of Conduct. There's nothing wrong with that this code of conduct. I have no problems with that code of conduct. As a matter of fact, many companies, free and open source projects, proprietary projects use this code of conduct because it's simple and kind of straightforward. Companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, they've used this code of conduct in projects of theirs. Other free and open source projects, Atom, GitLab, Monorails, Discourse uses it. Mentioned, companies like Google, Golang uses it. Nothing wrong with that code of conduct at all. There's really no reason to debate, the kernel team moving to that code of conduct. It all centers around the debate, really, this person behind it, and I don't know why people, this person, by the way, Imke, she's transgendered, and she's really out there. She's one of these hardcore social justice warriors, very leftist. Again, uses any platform she's on as, a political platform. She's been featured in stories on CNN. The far right often, criticizes her because she's very far left. So she's been featured in stories on Breitbart, Vox Day. Anyway, Imke, I don't know why we're talking about her. The code of conduct she wrote is fine. I have no problems with the kernel team implementing that particular code of conduct. All this crap and infighting over on Reddit and the mailing list and forums and everywhere else about the code of conduct. A lot of people say we don't need to implement this kind of social justice warrior crap. Well, you know what? I would have problems interjecting politics into anything, but this is nothing as far as being a social justice warrior. We want our community to be a harassment-free experience for everyone. Okay, I'm good with that. Use welcoming and inclusive language. Yeah, standard, like, human behavior, right? I mean, we all kind of know the right and wrong things to do. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Be respectful. Okay, gracefully accept constructive criticism. All right, focus on what is best for the community. Yeah, show empathy toward others. There's nothing wrong with this code of conduct, but a lot of people have just jumped all over this code of conduct because of the person behind it. They see, again, Imke using a lot of her positions in various organizations and stuff as political platforms. They're all jumping on Imke, and because they're jumping on Imke, they're jumping on the code of conduct. Anyway, this one thread here in Reddit, there's 666 comments on it, and it is just people spewing all kinds of vile and filthy hate, both right and left-leaning political garbage. This stuff has no business in the free and open source communities. Politics has no business in our communities. If you guys want to use these divisive political topics, and all politics is divisive, go to Twitter to do this stuff. Keep that stuff out of our open source community. There's no reason to interject politics into anything we do in open source and the free software movement. There's just not. I don't know how this stuff... I don't even know why the internet blew up the way they did about this new code of conduct. There's nothing controversial about the code of conduct itself at all. The person behind it, who cares? You don't like Coraline Imke? I don't even know the lady. Who cares? She has no... I mean, the code of conduct, we can separate that from her. She's not involved in kernel development. I mean, she has no real power over the kernel. Anyway, the big story, Linus leaving, at least temporarily. Hopefully when he comes back, if he does come back, hopefully he's a changed man. People don't change, though. Let's be honest. People like to talk about they can change, they can work on themselves, change themselves, become a new person. That is complete and total BS. Nobody ever really changes. Linus is going to be the same Linus, but you know what? He can still be the same Linus and, have his outburst and curse and say crazy things. Just don't say it in public. Don't insult somebody on a mailing list or, in writing, where everybody sees it. You know what? Keep those kinds of crazy comments to yourself. That's all you got to do. Just have a little more restraint. You can still be the same fiery guy that you always were, but publicly, it's a bad image. And you know what? We, as the open source community, we need to start holding these people accountable, including people like Linus Torvalds. He does not get a pass. He does not. He is not God, right? He's just a man. We would never allow somebody to talk to other people the way Linus sometimes talks to other people. But, because of who he is. And you know what? He kind of is a god. We worship the guy. I mean, he created the kernel. He created the operating system that we're using. But still, we have to hold him accountable. No one is above the law. And ran over. before I go, this show was made possible by the producers of this show, my highest tiered supporters over on Patreon. Anselm, Carlos, David, Leor, and Rob. You guys rock. You guys make this show possible. The show is also brought to you by the fine ladies and gentlemen. You see their names on the screen. These are all my supporters from Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel. You will find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.